Hello everyone, welcome back to Franci Talks Japanese Arts. I'm Franci, and if you're a long-time subscriber, you may have noticed that it's been a while. And if you're one of those, or if you're even someone who subscribed while I was gone, I just want to say thank you. It's really heartwarming, and I'm glad to be back. And if you're new here, well, I think this is a great time to find my channel because I'm starting a new journey through Japanese art history with this video. And so, what more to say? Let's jump right in. So to start this journey, I actually want to go back to the very beginning. And what I mean is when the first human beings walked in the Japanese territory. They walked to the Japanese territory. This happened about 100,000 years ago. And when I say walked, I really mean it, because at the time, the Japanese territory was not an archipelago. It was actually connected to the East Asian continent. And this means that 100,000 years ago, people were able to walk into what we now call Japan. And this was about during the last ice age, and eventually the temperature rose, the ice melted, and in this way Japan became disconnected from the mainland. And again, time passed, and about 32,000 years ago, we see the appearance in the Japanese territory of the first man-made stone tools. These were very utilitarian in nature, and you can imagine utilitarian in the way they looked. They were mostly blades such as stone knives and stone axes. And if we make another quite big jump, we find the start of ceramic production in Japan. This started about 16,000 years ago, and the oldest pottery fragments in Japan have been discovered in a site called Oda Yamamoto. There are 46 fragments of earthenware which are believed to have been part of ceramic pots. These are the oldest ceramics in Japan, and they are also considered amongst the oldest ceramics in the world. These were part, as we said, of pots used for cooking and other everyday activities, and it is believed that they were rather simple in nature. However, even if they might seem simple to us today, I would argue they're not simple at all. This is because we can see this as the origin, as the basis of what became the ceramic production of this prehistorical period, which became more and more elaborate step by step. More decoration appeared. And in this desire to decorate ceramics, in this desire for ornamentation, for decoration, we can pinpoint the origin of Japanese art. I always like to think of a definition of what is art, which I heard from a scholar, from the professor of East Asian art at the University of Genoa in Italy. That's Donatella Failla. And at the beginning of her classes, she kinda asked herself, what is art? And her answer to this question was everything that is superfluous, everything that is unnecessary. So whenever a craftsperson is making an object, whatever they choose to do that is not necessary for the most basic use of this object, well, that choice is art. So let's keep this in our mind as we go through today's video. The fragments from Oda Yamamoto were dated to 14,500 BCE. It is believed that these vessels were made either by people called the Jomon or by people who just preceded them, so we could consider them proto Jomon. The Jomon are the people who inhabited the Japanese archipelago, and we can define them as semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers and early agriculturalists. And what we call the Jomon period spanned from the year 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE. This, as you can understand, is an incredibly long time span, and Jomon culture saw a lot of changes and development throughout this incredibly long time. One material came to characterize the Jomon, and this is clay. During the earliest beginning stages of the Jomon period, the Jomon created simple vessels with a flat or rounded bottom. We start seeing decoration on these vessels. There were different types of decoration, which included incising the clay with bamboo sticks, stamping it with shells. However, there is one type of decoration which featured a lot, and this is cord marks. Cord marks were made by wrapping a cord around the stick and then dragging the stick on the surface of the pot while the clay was still wet, dragging, or more exactly, rolling the stick. And there were different methods to roll the cord. There were different methods to then imprint this decoration on the clay, and that's why there's been loads of these cord patterns have been found. And we have to say that this decoration with the cord marks actually gives the name to the whole culture, to this whole period. In fact, Jomon means cord marked. And it's a really interesting story that I like to say about how this name was given to the Jomon. The story is that the name was given by an American zoologist called Edward Sylvester Morse. Edward Sylvester Morse worked at the Japanese Imperial University, and he was a professor of zoology, of course. And one day he was researching shellfish, and he was on a train from Tokyo to Yokohama. And on the way, he recognized from the window of his train, from looking outside the window, what he recognized to be a shell mound. Now, if you don't know what shell mounds are, well, let me tell you about them because I am obsessed. I love shell mounds. Shell mounds are basically dump sites because the ancient people would, like the Jomon, they would eat shellfish and they would throw away the shells in a designated location, and eventually the shells accumulated and created actual mounds. And basically it's the same thing that would happen in my hamster's enclosure when he eats his seeds and just discards the shells, always in the same spot. And if I didn't clean it out, eventually it would turn into a mound. I think these shell mounds are so fascinating because so many things other than shells have been found in them. This includes jewelry, include pottery shards, include animals and human bones. And a lot of the times we don't really know why those things were there. And that was exactly the case for the shell mound in Omori that was discovered by Edward Sylvester Morse, because in 1877 he actually got the permission to excavate the shell mound, and he found the first shards, the first examples of Jomon pottery that he studied, he collected, and he named Jomon after the cord mark decoration which they featured. This is also said to have been the start of modern archaeology in Japan, which is very interesting, but maybe it's better to leave this story for another time. Let's talk briefly about how these Jomon pottery, these vessels, were made. So what they did was making them by hand by creating coils of clay and then stacking these coils on top of each other to create like a taller object, and then they smoothed out the surface both inside and outside of the vessel, and finally they applied whatever decoration they wanted to. The vessel was then left to dry, and then of course it was fired to harden it, and the firing happened not in a kiln, because kilns hadn't been created at the time. If they were fired, it is believed, either in open bonfires or in fires lit inside pits that were dug out of the ground. Let's fast forward to the middle of the Jomon period. This time was considered a high point for Jomon culture. There was a high population count. There was a high amount of ceramic production, and the vessels themselves became more elaborate, more sophisticated. We find these ornamental features on the rim and also more three-dimensional decorations applied onto the body of the vessels. These three-dimensional decorations were sometimes organic in their representations. They represented animals or faces of human beings in a very stylized manner. And there is evidence that these pots were used for practical reasons. They were, for example, used for cooking. However, the scholar Tsujinobu states that while the vases themselves may have been used for practical reasons, the decoration applied to them were most definitely not practical in their nature. And he claims that these three-dimensional decorations definitely placed these vessels in the realm of artistic expression. I want to have a look at a specific pot from the middle of the Jomon period. This pot was found in the Yamanashi prefecture, and it features these two faces onto its body. One is placed towards the top, and the second one is at the middle of its body. It is generally believed that the nature of this decoration must have been a narrative nature, that it must have carried some kind of meaning. And given the two faces, it has been hypothesized that the representation was actually the one of childbirth. We could interpret the face at the top of this vessel to be the face of a mother, and the face at the middle of the body of this vessel as the face of a child being born. The middle of the Jomon period also saw the production of one of the most recognizable and loved styles of Jomon ceramics, and this is a vessel called kaen-doki, which translates as flame pots. These vessels are characterized by these protrusions, which remind us in their shapes of shooting flames. We call them these, however, we do not know if they actually were supposed to represent flames. The vessels generally feature decorations on their whole body, and their bodies are rather thick and deep. And with these shooting flames, let's call them, they have been described as having an outstanding sense of form. Their role in Jomon society has not been entirely understood yet. There is evidence that they were used for cooking, and hypotheses have been put out there that they were maybe used for rituals, and otherwise just simply owning one of these pots because of how sophisticated and beautiful they are and the effort and skill they must have required to make. Simply owning one may have worked as a kind of status symbol. Now let's move towards the end of the Jomon period. This was actually a hard time for Jomon people because the temperatures went down again, they lowered again, it became colder, food was harder to find, and so the number of the Jomon population decreased, and we see a decrease in the ceramic production and also in the decoration of their ceramic production. This move toward simpler vessels may have been caused by these hardships. Perhaps there was less time to dedicate to creativity, the creative act, but it may have also been an influence coming from the East Asian continent. We will talk more about this influence coming from the continent in one of the next videos. However, even if ceramics got simpler, there was still some new developments in the Jomon pottery. For example, a new type of vessel appeared. It's this kind of spouted ceramic vessel. These were usually covered in decoration as well. They were decorated with patterns of swirls and this kind of wave design, and they were usually dark in color, and usually they had this kind of shiny finish which was achieved by covering them in soot and then polishing it off. So we reached the end of the Jomon period, but there is just one last ceramic production that I want to talk about, because this happened throughout all of the Jomon period, and this is ceramics which were covered in lacquer. Now, lacquer is an organic material which is extracted from a tree called Toxicodendron verniciferum, and it's the sap of this tree. And lacquer is actually a very hard material to work with. This is because the sap is toxic to humans when handled, and also it's very difficult to extract. To this day, extracting sap from lacquer wood is a very intensive labor. But using lacquer, it has various positive effects on the object that it is applied to. For example, it makes it more water resistant and just more resistant to damage in general. Lacquer is a mainstay in Japanese art, but originally it was believed that these lacquer techniques and the use of lacquer had been introduced from the East Asian continent, and it had been introduced from China, for example, and then from Korea. However, finding these Jomon lacquered objects, it hints to a local use of lacquer since the most ancient times. So as we've seen, the Jomon period, the Jomon culture was truly characterized by clay. The Jomon people truly mastered their clay production. So today we saw vessels. However, that's not all they created. They also created jewelry in ceramic, and they also created these outstanding clay figurines called dogu. These dogu, we can say that the Jomon used as much of their creativity in dogu as they did with their ceramic vessels. And the dogu are the focus of my next video. So if you want to see that, make sure to subscribe so you can catch it when it comes out. I want to thank you for watching, for staying with me until the end. I hope that you loved seeing Jomon ceramics. And if you did, I would be so happy if you left me a comment or a like. And if you want to support the channel, you can look in my descriptions, and there's different ways to support the channel. But for now, I just want to thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!